Well, hello and welcome to the Church Office Podcast. My name is Gavin Smith, and it's a joy to welcome you today to our Admin and Ops podcast. We love talking about the work of ministry behind the scenes. Whether you're an administrator, church manager, you're a treasurer, you're a trustee, you're a pastor, we have a whole bunch of people listening to the podcast. And thank you for those who kindly send in their thank yous and their encouragements. We really appreciate it on the podcast. Before I get into our special guest, we've got Manny Kemp joining us. We're going to be talking about the role of a treasurer, which is exciting, and how we can care for them and support them in best we can. I'd like to do a big shout out to our sponsors, Church Suite. We're really grateful for Gavin and the team at Church Suite who have got behind the church office and have kindly sponsored the podcast. And if you've not come across their software, their cloud-based software before, then please check it out. This is a time saver. This will help you in your role in so many different ways. If you're leading and organizing a church, then having the ability to do rotas, having the ability to do small groups, there's a database, there's a whole load of flows. The list is endless. This will help you so much. So please go out and check out churchsuite.com. Manny, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Hello, it's good to be here.
It's great to have you on, and we've been chatting about it for the last few months. I've been fitting into your busy schedule. Manny is busier than I am, so but thrilled to have him on. Manny's a deacon at the Eden Baptist Church in Cambridge, and you're responsible for the money. Really, you are the treasurer.
Yes, that's a pretty good summary. Yeah,
and that puts a bit of fear into some people. Being a treasurer, kind of a scary role.
It's perhaps not the easiest one to recruit for. I think that is a generally observed truism.
Yeah, that is very true. And we meet lots and lots of treasurers who are in their 70s and 80s who are still trying to recruit and find somebody to pass on. And that's we joke about it, but it's a real reality, isn't it, out there?
Very much so. I mean, you're describing. Yeah, there are a lot of younger treasurers out there, but certainly there are a lot of much older ones, and that is one of the key reasons. I mean, sometimes that's because they're treasurers in churches where we've got aging congregations, and that's perhaps more prevalent in some denominations than others. But where you've got a church demographic that tends to age, you're going to see church officers tending to age as well. But treasurer, I think there's when I first agreed to become treasurer, just coming up to 10 years ago. My father said to me, if you agree to do this now, you're going to be doing this when you're an old man. And well, I'm older now, but I don't know. There's a record set in our church. We have a deacon who served as treasurer and various other roles. I think he was a deacon for well over 30 years in total. Wow. So he's sort of that's the record. That's the aspiration.
That's the aspiration, to go past that point. Well, mate, yes. It's such an important role in the church, and I know lots of church managers who have been appointed to kind of oversee building, finance, and operations, and they take on some of the role as the treasurer, and so some of that role falls into church managers. So just aware that there are lots of church managers listening to this, and they probably know the same kind of pain that some treasurers do. Manny, you're also involved in ACAT, aren't you? You've got you've got this lovely little
bit of a giveaway there, wasn't there?
we thoroughly enjoyed speaking to Ashley and sort of partnering with you guys. Tell us a little bit about the association if people haven't come across that.
Yeah, sure. So the Association of Church Accountants and Treasurers, or as you can see behind me, ACAT, it's a charity that basically works to support those involved in church finance, accounting, administration, to a lesser extent, governance, to a lesser extent. I would say our core audience is treasurers, but we also provide support in various forms to wider trustee bodies as well. Yeah. That support takes the form of, particularly for our membership, guidance, advice. There's an advisory helpline which member churches can make use of, usually through a contact form on our website. If they are signed up, they can receive newsletters with regulatory updates and various other useful bits of information about what's going on in the world of charity financial administration, stuff from the Charity Commission, that sort of thing. We have a comprehensive handbook in the members area of our website, which again members can access, so it gives them a comprehensive how-to on lots of different topics, mostly relating to finance, accounting, and fundraising, but
Yeah.
some other bits and pieces. There's some stuff in there on data protection, health and safety, other topics that tend to come up quite a lot and
Mm.
perhaps are not so heavily covered elsewhere or are not necessarily covered cheaply elsewhere.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then on top of that, we provide a range of training courses, which I always mention a bit separately because that's not something we provide as part of a membership package, but rather that's something that members and non-members can just sign up to separately. And that's almost entirely done online over
Yeah.
this medium, basically. But then occasionally we run something in person, particularly if we're working with a block member that is keen to have an in-person event for their people. So most of our membership consists of block members, Baptist Union, Methodist Church, about half the Anglican Diocese, FIEC, um, and a few others of varying sizes.
Yeah, and it's a brilliant organization, and I know people have used the helpline and had some quick advice and some really useful steps because when you need to turn to someone that you can trust, it's great to be able to turn to ACATs and ACAT and be able to hear some good advice. You were saying to me earlier, which I just thought was a stunning statistic, and I know we're not massively putting this out as a bold thing, but you've trained over 1,000 treasurers. I mean, when you told me that, I was absolutely amazed. What amazing grace that is, and what a staggering achievement that is to bless and to work with that number of people.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of those are people whose faces I've never seen, because they are, as I said, most of our training is done online now. Since we moved to online training, that's often enabled us to run
Yeah,
bigger training courses, but we do those as Zoom webinars. So a lot of these people who I've trained, it's in a medium where I might see their questions pop up in the Q&A,
yeah,
but I don't get to meet them. But then we have other events, conferences, in-person training courses. You yourself, of course, were at our conference last year, and we were very
yes,
grateful to have you there and really enjoying building a bit of a partnership with the church office. But as you saw, lots of people there, treasurers, non-treasurer trustees, people in other
yeah,
roles,
yeah.
some staff, mostly volunteers, and they're all coming with different perspectives, different roles, and all with slightly different questions. But as I think I mentioned to you earlier, everyone's got their own issues, but you do start to see some common
Yeah.
themes emerging.
Yeah, you do, and we'll come back to that. So yeah, so if you've not heard of ACAT, then please go and check out their website and look for the membership. It's a relatively it's cheap, isn't it, to sign up? Isn't it
It
like
is
20,
it is very
21 or
cheap.
25 pounds, something like that.
It's £24 for an per year for an individual membership.
Yeah.
That gets you the handbook, the newsletters, any other incidental resources in the members area, and unlimited use of the helpline.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So it's an absolute bargain, and let me encourage you
Mm.
to sign up to them and yeah, get that kind of free advice. I've had the newsletter on numerous occasions where it's just prompted me to go in and find out a little bit more up to date information. I love the conference, and it was great to kind of be in the room. 100 people in the room, just loving what they're doing, serving their churches faithfully. There was such a warm welcome from all the ACAT team. It was lovely, and you hosted it at your church in Cambridge, and it
Yeah,
was
we
just
we did.
amazing.
Yeah, it was real. It was a real pleasure to be able to host it there. There were various reasons why we went down that route. Not least the fact that we like being able to run the conference as a hybrid online in-person event where we can. And if I'm
Yeah,
running it from my own church, I just have the advantage of being able to use the tech that I'm already familiar with to
yeah,
make sure that we can do that, because that's not necessarily a cheap service to buy in, but it's an awfully cheap service if it's already integrated and available.
yeah. That's
And
right.
being a treasurer, I do like saving money wherever I can. Um, I sort of just circling back to something from earlier, it is worth noting if we're encouraging people to look into ACAT membership, we should also encourage people to double check whether they're already members.
Okay.
Because, as I said, we have a lot of denominational bodies as block members. And when you go to the section on our website where you can explore signing up for membership, you should be able to find somewhere also that lists who the current block members are, because a lot of members of our affiliated denominations that have signed up don't necessarily know that they're members, and it would be a bit
Okay.
of a shame and a waste of money to sign up for an individual membership only to find out, oh no, I was already a member because I was in the Baptist Union or I was in the FIEC, and I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah, yeah.
realise that sort of comes up with the rations there. So do check first, I think is the message there, and then if you're not in a block member, as I say, individual is still pretty cheap.
It is cheap, and you're even trying to save people money, by checking if they're in a denominational group.
Goes
Manny,
with the turf.
I love that. I love that. So let's talk about some of the themes, and I said to you, let's talk about the challenges and the joys. So let's go for the challenges first. What are some of the challenges that treasurers are facing that you're seeing?
So I think there's generally a workload challenge. It's a busy role. It involves doing quite a lot. It's generally recognized in most contexts I've seen as being one of the more demanding lay roles that you see in a church.
Yeah,
I think there is a particular challenge that comes from the fact that very few, sometimes no others in your church actually know that much about what you're doing.
yeah,
Or that is to say, they don't really understand the world that you occupy. So it can be quite a lonely role. And this is true of a lot of people. I mean, you work with church administrators and managers and so forth, who are very often in that same sort of situation. But I would
yeah,
say for a lot of other roles, it can be lonely at the top. Pastors, but pastors often have, say, in an independent church like mine, there'll be other lay elders, which means there's at
yeah,
least someone else they can talk to who has some
yeah,
sort of concept of what they're up to. Youth workers have got volunteers they can talk to who are also involved in that. Maybe they don't always, but they often do. Treasurers very often are in that category of solitary servers in their particular area of ministry.
yeah. And that has its challenges, doesn't it? It does, and that's why being part of a kind of ACAT and other groups like UCAN and things like that can really help you, can't they? To find people who do exactly what you're doing in the role, who just you walk in a room together and you get each other before you even got into the detail of conversation, but you understand the pressures,
Yeah,
and that's true, isn't it? The time element is a lot as compliance gets more and more challenging, as reporting gets more and more challenging. There does feel like there's a little bit of pressure on the treasurer to keep everything up to date. And
yeah. I mean, the regulatory framework, it has shifted to be more demanding, and it only ever really shifts in that direction. It
yeah,
is it is almost unheard of to see um, a relaxation. Now we have to wait and see what happens for those of us who, have the fun of using the charity SORP.
yeah,
So that is to say, those of us that use accruals accounts and therefore have to comply with, this thing called the Statement of Recommended Practice, which, if you are on accruals accounts, is not recommended; it's mandatory.
yeah,
There's a new version of that that's going to go out for public consultation this year. Maybe we'll see some relaxation of some of the reporting requirements. I wouldn't hold my breath. As a general rule,
yeah,
the
yeah,
changes go in the other direction. Like every year, when you're doing the annual return for a registered charity, you go on the Charity Commission website, the question set that they ask you with your annual return seems to expand every year.
it really does. That list of policies this year might have freaked out quite a number of people.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I can understand why when they're adding these things, they look at them and go, this is a good thing to ask, this is a good thing to encourage people
yeah,
to have. But the cumulative effect of all of that on organizations that are primarily volunteer led, volunteer managed, and I think even in churches where you've got a staff team, which is, most to some extent have got at least one person who's being paid to do what they do, even if it's just the minister. But you do find a very substantial proportion of that leadership is coming from volunteers. These are
yes,
people who don't have professional training in what they're doing. Maybe sometimes you're fortunate enough to find a professional accountant who can be your treasurer. Maybe you find a charity lawyer who can help you with compliance. Majority of churches aren't going to be so fortunate as that.
yeah,
So you've got a group of volunteers trying to make do with their best efforts. And yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, just for context, I should say I am not an accountant. I've
yeah,
been, I am a fairly well practiced amateur at this stage in the field of accounting and bookkeeping because I've learnt it in the role that I'm in. But I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
have any formal background in it, no formal, training prior to taking on that role, which it's part of what makes it a challenge because you step into the role and you have
yeah,
to try and learn a whole load of stuff. I personally think it's also quite an encouragement. I like to remind people that I'm not an accountant because most other treasurers or people considering being treasurer aren't accountants. And I like to say,
yeah,
don't worry, you can that doesn't have to be an impediment to being able to do the role. You can
yes.
actually make do perfectly well with a non-accountant.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the reporting side of it is one thing, isn't it? But actually, um, trying to get alongside the ministry in your church, those elders in your church, to try and find out what is it they really want to try and do this year, and how can our budgets support that vision and that desire and that direction that they're taking the church, and whether that be a church plant or whether that be a new ministry, maybe they're going to totally change the way they do discipleship. It has an impact, doesn't it, on the budget, and the treasurer, I guess, it has such a role in making something happen. And maybe that's getting onto the joys, because there is a joy, isn't there, in making things happen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. That the treasurer is, is an implementer. The treasurer is a facilitator, making processes happen and work. Yeah, if you take away the treasurer, if you take away the person who's making sure things get paid, things get planned, budgeted, and so forth, then you do find fairly quickly a lot of processes start sort of falling to bits.
Yeah.
So the flip side of that is, yeah, when you're in that role and doing that, I think maybe for a lot of treasurers, you don't necessarily think about that in the day to day.
Mm,
And it's a
mm,
really good thing, I think,
mm.
for people in those sorts of roles to pause and think about the sort of stuff you've just said there, because that can be a real source of encouragement,
Yeah.
recognizing, yeah, this isn't just, I've got another load of bank reconciliations and invoices to slog through. Actually, no, by doing that, you're enabling the core, gospel ministry of the church to function at a
Yeah.
basic level. You're enabling this day, this week's ministry to happen.
Yeah, absolutely right. No, that's great, and we'll get into some of those other joys, because there is joy in serving our leaders in that way. Um, one of the other challenges, not just time, not just kind of the changing environment of what's happening. What are some of the other things, Manny, that treasurers face?
So there's a whole series of very mundane, practical things that treasurers get frustrated by, and when you get a group of treasurers together, they'll all nod and and ah about them. So banking is one of them. I
It
think
is, yeah,
most of us have encountered problems with banks,
yeah,
particularly with the mainstream high street banks, many of which are not particularly friendly towards charities, or at least not particularly helpful, and some of their systems are not necessarily designed
yeah,
to accommodate charities. The big one being dual signatory.
yeah,
It's normal practice for churches and charities to have a dual signatory checkbook. But how do you translate that to online banking? Well, of course you can, and
yeah.
many banks do, but there are other banks that don't do it terribly well, or they do it in a way that feels like a bolt onto a system that was designed mainly for organizations that don't have to think about that.
Mm.
And actually, in many ways, the banks are keeping checkbooks alive as an item in the
Yeah,
world of finance
yeah,
because of their poor catering to the needs of the charity sector.
yeah,
Lots of checks are
yeah,
still being written because it's the only way to make, with some banks, dual signatory work. So there's banking. I think there's, other things that commonly emerge. I think there's the problem of trustee legal duties, governance, and recognition. This is maybe less of an externally imposed problem and an internal cultural issue you see in a lot of
yeah.
churches.
Mm,
Recognizing that legal governance duty and that accountability for a church's financial health, and just for making sure its financial processes are in place,
mm,
is a shared duty of all the trustees.
mm.
So there's a lot of church trustee bodies that don't really recognize or appreciate this isn't just the treasurer's job. We have a trainer in ACAT who has a bit of a catchphrase that she uses, which is, well, treasurers don't have problems, trustees do. Because legally speaking, that is the truth.
Yeah,
Trustees are
yeah,
accountable; they're on the hook if this stuff
yeah,
goes wrong, and
yeah,
it's not good enough just to say, "Well, this guy over here is the treasurer, so it's his job," and the rest of us, we'll focus on the real ministry,
yeah,
while Jim over there is going to deal with the
yeah,
boring accounty stuff.
yeah. And you identify, don't you, there some real practical things there, challenges. Yeah, I'm just thinking about also the time that people might put into some kind of finance report that goes to the elders or the trustees, and what's when you get into a discussion that overruns, what's the thing that ends up being cut off the agenda? It's often the finance report. And you've just spent 4 or 5 hours, or a treasurer has, just prepping that ready for the meeting, and it can be incredibly disheartening, can't it, in that
Yeah,
aspect as
I mean
well?
that can happen with anything if it gets squeezed off the edge of an agenda, when things are busy. So the question is, do we have a consistent attitude that says
Yeah,
finance accounts can be
yeah,
deprioritized in that way. And I think again in some churches, this is not the case. In some churches, it's very much the case that
Mm.
there is that culture and attitude that says we don't really want to have to think about this stuff. We will talk about it because we want to humor the treasurer, or because we know we sort of have to, but we kind of, we grudgingly accept the fact that we have to.
Yeah.
And then that means that inevitably, when there's a choice to be made, it's finance that sort of gets either pushed off the agenda or kind of rushed through a bit, or it's not necessarily even so much the time allocated in meetings, it's how much headspace do people allow for this when they are
Yeah.
making decisions. You mentioned budgeting earlier.
Mm.
To what extent are church elders cognizant of the budgetary implications of all the ideas they have for changing the ministry?
Yeah. 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 It's interesting. When I went to a conference, I deliberately asked every pastor I engaged with, I was like, to tell me a little bit about your budget. And there was a few kind of vacant faces of
I can believe that.
I really should look into this kind of vibes.
So we've asked the question, even of treasurers,
Mm,
on training courses. We ask, does your church have a budget?
yeah,
And over the years, I would say that maybe the statistic has improved a little bit over the years, but we have generally seen maybe about half of churches don't even prepare a budget. So it's not just you ask the pastor and they look blank.
yeah,
The treasurer can't even vouch for there being a budget. And I see that as, frankly, quite a big governance problem,
yeah,
because if you really get down to the legal specifics of what trustees have to do, they're basically accountable for every penny that the charity holds in trust and is then spending. And how do you exercise accountability for spending at that kind of granularity
yeah.
if you don't have some sort of overarching plan that maps out what you're going to spend and
Mm,
how? And that's
mm,
what a budget is. That's what a budget
mm,
is for. Because if you don't do that, then you've got your trustees. The only other way to do it is the trustees have to, if there's no overarching plan, they've got to authorize individual transactions. And can you imagine an Anglican PCC, or a group of elders sitting down to go, right, so the church administrator wants to place an order for 5 packets of paper clips and
yeah,
3 new pens. Are we going to approve that? That conversation is not happening. So if there's no budget, then
yeah,
there's no exercising of that accountability, and that
yeah.
that leaves you vulnerable.
It does, doesn't it? And you raised some really good points there. And I think if you're listening to this as a church leader who acts as a treasurer, or sorry, acts as a trustee, please check in on your treasurer if you've got one. Please check in and see it, find out how they're doing, find out what kind of support they might need. Please prompt, listening to this podcast, would it prompt you to go and inquire of how they're doing? And you're right, Manny, the statistics that we've seen of churches not having budgets, and the majority of cases, they've got a decent, bank account with funds in it that have either been, just gathered or reserves, or they've sold amounts or whatever at some point. And so their levels of funds are high. So they're kind of under the impression of, well, we don't need to budget. We just spend the minimum that we need. And that approach really doesn't lend itself well to kind of investing in the ministry, seeing the ministry grow, seeing the ministry flourish. And that's sad to see, isn't it, in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at it through two lenses. There is the lens of scripture and theological understanding of what we're doing, and there's also the legal lens, because charity legal framework
Yeah,
applies to churches like it does to any other charity, and applies to the trustees of churches like any other group of charity trustees. So from that sort of theological and scriptural lens, I think you can recognize there's a principle of good stewardship that
yeah,
should be followed. So if you have got enough money that you don't need to urgently worry about running out of it, and realistically, actually, that if you get complacent enough, then you can be sitting on any amount. You'll find you'll
yeah,
be capable of running out of it if you mismanage it badly
yeah,
enough.
yeah,
But let's say let's say generally, yeah, you've got a church that is sitting on a decent amount of cash reserves. Um, if they're not thinking about how do we actually make the best use of what we've got, rather than just going, oh well, we've got enough to be getting on, so we're not going to think about it,
mm.
then parable of the talents, is this basically the behavior of the servant who takes
Yeah,
his one talent and he buries it,
yeah,
so that at least he's still got it, but it's not earned interest. It's not made any money for his master. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, it's been a while since I've read that parable, but I seem to recall that the master comes back and isn't very happy. But then you've also got to look at it through the legal lens, which says, well, there's a legal obligation on trustees to make sure that the charity is using its resources
Yeah.
in the pursuit of its charitable purposes, which is basically secular law telling us we have to, do the work of the gospel,
Yeah.
which is nice. It's nice when that
Yeah.
happens. It's not very often that secular law commands us to do the same thing that the Bible is commanding us to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, that doesn't just mean make sure you've got enough. It also means if you've got money, it's because it's been donated to you in trust with
Mhm.
the expectation that it's going to be used to further ministry or to further, charitable activity
Yeah.
serving certain purposes, the purpose of the ministry of your church.
Yeah.
So if you just sit on that money without trying to make the best of it that you can and doing the most effective ministry with it that you can, then you're not just generally exercising a poor principle of stewardship. You're also failing actually to honour the principles of charitable trust.
Mm.
You've been entrusted with something and you're not honouring the terms of trust on which it's been given. I mean, this doesn't mean that charities and churches have to spend all the money they get and not accumulate reserves. But you need to
Yeah.
accumulate
Yeah.
reserves in a planned and responsible manner rather than
Yeah.
a sort of an unplanned, you're just accumulating because you've not thought about spending as much as you've got coming in.
Yeah. Absolutely right. And yeah, that's helpful, Manny. That's really, really helpful. So let's move on to some of the positives then. Let's
Let's
I want to hear as many positives, Manny, and joys that there is in this role.
oh,
What have you personally enjoyed being
well,
treasurer?
it helps if you're the sort of person who likes this kind of thing, but you can make some really cracking spreadsheets when you're a treasurer. And I think for a lot of
Yeah.
people who naturally gravitate towards the role, that sort of thing does actually give a great deal of satisfaction, and it's really nice. It's a real blessing being able to use those sorts of skills that are maybe just a bit nerdy, a bit geeky,
But wonderful.
but you could use that for the work of the Lord, which is
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
So it gives you the opportunity to use your skills, and I appreciate that for a lot of people who are treasurers, they're not treasurers because they've necessarily got a really strong grip on that same skill set. They're the treasurer because no one else was going to do it, and someone had to, stick their neck out and volunteer for the role. But for those of us
Yeah.
who, as I say, not an accountant, but if you like playing with spreadsheets, you like playing with numbers, if you've got that kind of talent, that's really satisfying.
Yeah.
Um, I think there's something quite nice when you see the generosity of people.
Yes. Excellent.
Because
Yeah.
that financial giving to the church is, rightly and properly a very confidential thing.
Mm.
Um, but someone has got to see the details of it, and
Yeah.
the person who or people who do get to see that do from time to time get the fringe benefit of being able to rejoice in the generosity
Yeah.
of some people. And I don't just mean the people who are giving the most money. You're just aware you know that there are widow's mite situations going on as
Yeah.
well. So you
Yeah.
see gifts big or small, and you go, this is happening because God is moving people's hearts to
Yeah.
give to the church. Like whenever I see a regular standing order come in 1 month, I go, I remember that being a slightly lower amount last month. Oh, look, such and such has increased
Yeah.
their standing order. That's lovely, and praise God for it.
Yeah, that's such a big highlight for me doing church finances. Yeah, I love that aspect of it, just being able to see God's faithfulness and Him, working through our members to give generously. And we recently took up a mission fund to support some church planting in Turkey and various other places,
Oh,
and the church just warmed up and just gave so faithfully over and above. And you're right, no one else sees the figures but us. And it's such a privilege to be able to see how people
it is.
participate
I
in
mean, you
that.
you can share overall statistics with people,
Yeah,
but when you see how much some individuals are giving, that adds something, and that's really special.
it
Um,
really is. It really is, and to see that it is a joy. And I know there's been times where, I've been in an elders meeting and they've been praying for a certain ministry and just thinking how could they develop this and how could they provide some new equipment, say, or something. And you hear them praying about it, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, you see gifts start coming in, or we've been successful with a grant, or something like that comes in. You say, "Isn't God being so good to us?" And just seeing those prayers answered, weeks, maybe months later, But having an awareness of it and being able to see it is a tremendous privilege. Um, yeah, I love that. Any other joys?
Yes, I'm sure I can think of some. I mean, again, this depends, varies a bit with church, depends on the culture, but uh, I would say people sometimes find that the treasury is perhaps a bit undervalued. I would say that in a lot of churches, the problem that you might find is that the treasurer is not very well understood,
Yeah,
or the area that they operate in is not very well understood, but actually they are very highly valued.
yeah,
So I run into a lot of gratitude in my role, and it's really heartwarming. And I pray it doesn't go to my head because I get a lot of people, who are very grateful for what I do. And the phrase you hear a lot as a treasurer is "Thank you for everything that you do."
yeah,
And partly that's coming from a very sincere place because people have some notion that you're doing a lot of stuff and they're very grateful. And sometimes it's coming from a place of they don't actually really have any idea what you do, but they're sure you're doing a lot of stuff. And sometimes, depending on who's saying that, maybe you would actually quite like it if they had a bit more of an idea of what you do, especially if they're one of the non-treasurer church leaders.
yeah,
But you do find, and I've been very very blessed to be in this situation where I have generally found an abundance of gratitude and respect for
that's
this
great.
particular area of ministry, which is great. I appreciate, of course, that articulating that as a joy might it rather underscores maybe the pain that some treasurers
Yeah,
might feel in the role if they are in an environment where they're not actually treated with that kind of respect or gratitude, and that's really sad when that happens because actually, I think treasurers do generally deserve the gratitude that
yeah.
that I'm certainly seeing and experiencing in overabundance. I think every treasurer should be able to, to get that.
I agree. I agree. And yeah, if you're listening to this as a treasure, then thank you so much for all that you're doing in serving your church. Whether you hear a thanks or not, then from Manny and I, just that encouragement to that you are serving the church effectively, and it is gospel ministry and it supports gospel ministry. And the gospel just wouldn't go forward without, and the work of people behind the scenes in different roles, and yeah, that body analogy that Paul uses, isn't it, with many many parts, and all the different
Well,
parts are different and play a different part and different role, and
we reference that chapter at the start of almost every training course that we run.
I love that.
So it's what chapter 12 of Paul's first letter to the
Yeah,
Corinthians, isn't it, where he's using that sort of extended metaphor. And the verse that we cite, anyone who's been on one of our courses will remember, there's always a slide early on with 1 Corinthians 12, verse 28, talking about the different spiritual giftings.
yeah,
And it depends a little bit on your choice of Bible translation, exactly how this gets rendered. But the word that comes up, if you use, I think certainly if you use the ESV, is administration.
yeah,
And we can include financial administration under that. And I think what's really important about that verse is it comes in the context of Paul's broader extended conversation about spiritual gifts. That he's
yeah,
explicitly talking in those terms, and
yeah,
the things he's listing include not only administration, but speaking in tongues, healing,
yeah,
preaching, teaching.
yeah,
All the
yeah,
very overtly spiritual stuff, all the very overtly miraculous stuff is part of this list of gifts, and they're in that same list. Towards the end of the list, granted, but in that list, God has provided not only those who prophesy and preach and teach and do miraculous healings, but also those with gifts of administration.
yeah,
And I think that's just really important for people to, in the treasurer role or in the wider church, to be mindful of if they are tempted to think of administration as a sort of a poor relation of quote unquote real ministry,
yeah,
because it really isn't. It's
yeah,
integral, and you can believe that because God says so. Yeah,
yeah,
that's not just
yeah,
this is not ACAT's self-interested opinion in upping the prominence of church treasurers. This
yeah,
is God speaking through
yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, absolutely right. And just echo those words, mate. That's right. It is a vital role. Manny, just a couple of words of advice then, really. I get often uh questions posed to me about, how do we do this differently with our finances, and lots of people have moved from a kind of single treasurer role, and I think this is healthy, to a finance committee, or a number of people working in different ways on this. And I know some cloud-based software and some programs have helped enable people to take on different roles, whether it be take on the gift aid, whether it be to take on certain invoicing, and lots of the new software, you can upload receipts and lots of people can contribute in that way, which does save a lot of time. And I'm interested in your thoughts about that, because I like the idea of there being a team approach.
Mm.
I like the idea of people not being left on their own, and that we've got this, we're building in capacity in our churches that if someone goes down with sickness, our staff are still going to be paid, and because we've
Oh,
got other people that can
absolutely.
step
I
in,
mean, there are various ways you can de-risk, So I think that you sort of hit on about three different topics there. I think
Yeah,
one is the formulation of a finance team or committee.
yeah,
One is this very specific technological question, which is cloud-based software, which is
yeah,
enabling all sorts of useful stuff.
yeah,
And I think there's also this risk management element, which is you don't want to have a single point of failure because,
yes,
as morbid as it is to talk about it, your treasurer could go under a bus,
yeah,
in which case what happens? And I've known churches where they've had treasurers who have left, there've been fallings out, there's been illness, incapacitation, people have been bereaved, or treasurers have actually died in office.
yeah,
And the worst case, there was one church, I think I spoke to their pastor about this. They had their treasurer die, and they had no one else really had any visibility of their finances,
oh no,
and they had a whacking great deficit in their budget, and no one realized until it had accumulated to really quite an alarming shortfall, and suddenly they had that whole situation to deal with.
mm,
So
mm,
you need that sort of you need a bit of redundancy in there.
yeah,
Um, this then dovetails very nicely with the cloud accounting software discussion, because that puts you in a situation where one of your key dependencies, which is can you get at the computer that this stuff is all on,
mm,
is being dealt with,
yeah,
because now it's not stored on a single computer, it's stored in the cloud. Anyone with a login account can get at it. If you're in the extremis, you can talk to the service provider that's providing it to get someone else access
yeah,
if you did only have one user, but actually you can have multiple users. And most of these cloud-based solutions, they're pretty generous when it comes to how many users they'll let you have. Your old-fashioned desktop-based stuff, you'd have to buy separate licenses
yeah,
for each individual user. So, for example, I know of one company that is doing accounting software aimed heavily at churches. They've historically done desktop-based. They brought in cloud. They're now retiring the desktop-based
yeah,
because cloud is just the downside, of course, is if you have terrible internet, then it's not much help.
yeah,
Cloud-based accounting
yeah,
is pretty useless to
yeah,
you.
yeah,
But increasingly, most people have got access, and so it's convenient. You can get at it everywhere. You don't have to remember your own computer. If
yes,
you're logged in somewhere else, computer in the church office, hop on the browser. You've got
yeah,
access to all your accounting information. Get other members of the finance team on. Get other people who aren't even on the finance team. Backup people who can access the data in extremis. You
yeah,
can also, depending on the system, you can start differentiating the functions people have. So it may be that you've got a core finance team who can access everything and
mm,
do everything,
mm,
but then maybe you can open things up. So, and there's a few different software packages that can accommodate this to varying extents. But for example, expenses handling. You can make
mm,
it possible for people to log in directly and type in their expenses. That's going to save someone a job of
yeah.
manually copying stuff from an old-fashioned expenses claim form.
Yeah, it's so helpful, isn't it? And you can have somebody else go on and approve the expense, and then somebody can go on and make the payment. And they have thought through this. And one of our partners at the church office is Expense Plus, and Sam and Dan and those guys. Expense Plus have got a great piece of software that
Mm.
that we use for the church office. And Manny, you've got a partnership, haven't you, with ACATs? Do you want to
Yeah,
name those
so
ones as well? Because
Yeah, so I mean, people often, ACAT officially doesn't endorse any specific software solution as the
yeah,
solution because we have to maintain some degree of impartiality. But we do have active partnerships with two providers, Data Developments,
yeah,
who provide sort of finance coordinator, donations coordinator software, which they're the one who used to do it desktop and they're now retiring desktop and going all cloud.
yeah,
The one I use personally is called Liberty Accounts, and they're very
yeah,
good. I can vouch for them as a satisfied customer, as well as from ACAT having a partnership, and they're often present at our conferences. Expense Plus have also sometimes been involved sponsoring and or attending our conference, and people do often ask, on training courses. Obviously, I have to tell them, well, I don't explicitly endorse any one solution, but there are three that I do recommend consistently
Yeah.
that people should look into because they are designed for churches and charities, and they are Liberty Accounts, Data Developments, Expense Plus.
Yeah, and I've got experience with Expense Plus, and they're great. And so these things are time savers. These things are enable more people to get involved. So if you're still using your spreadsheet, and there's still ways that you can use your spreadsheet in these things, but transferring data onto there, you can look at your budgets. You can give budget holders a view of just a small section of what they've been spending. So it's quite empowering, and it's quite a useful tool. And I think it's worth considering if you're an older treasurer thinking, how do I pass this on? I've seen so many churches that have switched to some software that suddenly sparked some younger people to get involved in the finances because this is like second nature to them. And I think that's a useful thing. And I think, Manny, we'll finish off the podcast on this is for treasurers to consider who they can pass their role on to. Who are they training up? Who are they thinking about that can do this and serve alongside them? Because we do that in ministry, don't we, in so many ways. We have these training programs for elders, and we have internships for elders, but we don't have internships for administrators or treasurers.
It's true. I mean, a lot of what you do with elders, with training people up for becoming pastors, is you basically train people because you see someone with the potential, and maybe they go on to serve in your own church later and replace a vacancy that is there in your own church. Or very often, especially with training new pastors, they don't do that. They go off somewhere else and they serve in another church, and you've basically trained someone up and sent them off out there. There isn't really an analog to that in the world of treasury. Generally speaking, what happens is the treasurer, if they're being more proactive than most, is that they start, when they start feeling tired in the role, they try and look for someone and train them up. And that's done very much with a view towards internal vacancy filling. So I think that you've raised an interesting challenge there, which is actually, could we be thinking about encouraging people to think about not just treasury, but other non-pastoral supporting roles? You've seen the podcast episodes that I did with Adrian from the FIEC, where he uses the term administry to refer collectively to the sorts of areas we're working in. Is that something we could think about more holistically, not just our treasurer's getting a bit old and tired, we need to find a new treasurer, but can we think more broadly about how we build people up to take on these sorts of roles generally?
Yeah, I love that, Manny, and that's great. Mate, it's been fantastic to chat to you. Thank you so much for filling us in about ACAT, sharing your experience as a treasurer. And let me just label the point at the end here. Please go and ask your treasurer, if you're listening to this, how are you doing? If someone's responsible for the finances in your church, go and check in on them, go and encourage them, go and thank them for what they're doing, and ask them if there's any way that they could be served better. And particularly if you're in a kind of pastoral ministry or an elder or a trustee, actively taking and finding out how they're doing, finding out ways that you might be able to do things differently, whether that be in reporting, whether that be in software. Let's get behind this role, and if you're involved in it, then please be encouraged. If you've got any questions for Manny and I, if there's something that we can signpost you to, if there's someone some training that Manny's been talking about, then please let us know, and we would love to connect with you at questions@thechurchoffice.co.uk. Manny, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure.
And I look forward to seeing you at the annual conference, I guess.
Yeah,
brilliant.
We just need to figure out where it's going to be.
Well, thanks for listening today, and we hope you enjoyed the podcast. Goodbye.